There comes a moment, quiet but absolute, when something inside you shifts. You don't announce it. There are no fireworks, no long explanations, but the narcissist senses it, like the sudden absence of gravity. It's the moment they realize you're never coming back. It's not just that you left the room, or the house, or the relationship. It's that something essential in you has rearranged itself. The illusion you once clung to, the hope that if you just loved harder, tolerated more, explained better, they'd change, that illusion died, and with it their hold on you dissolved. The narcissist was never in love with you. They were in love with the reflection you offered them. They saw in you a mirror for their fantasy self, admired, adored, unquestioned. But the day you stopped believing in the fantasy was the day the mirror cracked. You no longer gave them the validation they fed on. You no longer accepted their shifting narratives or participated in their chaos. You watched the cycle. Idealize, devalue, discard, play out, and you chose, finally, to step outside of it. You stopped playing a game you never agreed to join in the first place. Your refusal to react was what truly terrified them. They were used to controlling you with your empathy, your confusion, your guilt. But now you were calm, not passive. Calm. Indifference is a powerful weapon against manipulation. It's not cruelty, it's clarity. You saw behind the mask, saw the insecurity beneath the arrogance, and that stripped away their power. They tried their old tactics, rage, pity, seduction, but none of it reached you anymore. You had rewired yourself. Their emotional hooks no longer found purchase in your skin, and something else happened. You stopped needing closure from them. You realized that closure isn't a conversation or an apology. It's a decision. You made peace with the idea that you'd never get the justice or explanation you once craved. You understood that the story doesn't need to be resolved to be over. And that made you dangerous, because you broke their cycle without permission. You ended a dance they believed only they could conclude. That moment when you walked away with your silence was louder than all their words combined. You also stopped trying to save them. Maybe for years you saw their pain, their trauma, and believed you could be the one to fix it, that if you just showed enough patience or love, they'd heal. But you finally learned the hardest truth of all. Some people drown you just to feel taller. You recognized that compassion without boundaries is martyrdom. You let go of the need to be their lifeline and chose instead to be your own. That act of self-rescue was the most radical thing you ever did. In doing so, you took responsibility, not for the abuse, but for your healing. You stopped blaming yourself for staying, and you stopped waiting for them to change. You recognized that your freedom wasn't something they'd ever hand you. It was something you had to claim, and when you did, the narcissist saw it. Perhaps for the first time with clarity. You had found a structure, a center, a selfhood that couldn't be manipulated. You had built something inside yourself that they could not enter, so no. The moment they knew you'd never return wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, spiritual, and irreversible. It was in the steadiness of your gaze, the silence of your departure, the boundaries they couldn't push past. It was in the way you no longer explained yourself, no longer chased closure, no longer bled empathy on their altar. You didn't just walk away. You became someone they could no longer recognize because you became someone whole. And that was the moment they knew. It was over, of course. Here's the fully expanded speech, written in 7 fluid, natural paragraphs, with point 2, the power of no, and all other ideas smoothly integrated into a narrative form. No bold, no italics, and no section headings. There is a moment, often unnoticed by the world but deeply felt within you, when something fundamental shifts. The person you once bent over backwards to please no longer holds sway over your emotions. You're not loud about it. You don't make a dramatic exit or deliver a final monologue. But the narcissist senses it. Something is missing. The friction, the fear, the pull, and they know almost instinctively that you've left in a way that cannot be reversed. What they once saw in you, a source of admiration, validation, and emotional energy, has vanished. The silence is different this time, not the silence of submission, but the silence of freedom. This moment was born not out of rage, but from exhaustion and clarity. You realized that your efforts to love, to help, to fix were never truly seen or appreciated. They were used. The narcissist thrived on your willingness to bend, to forgive, to remain even when your soul was screaming to leave. But one day you said no, and meant it. That small word, so often drowned in guilt or obligation, became a declaration of your autonomy. It was a moment of personal revolution. You refused to play the part they wrote for you in a drama they had to control. You chose discomfort over deception, and that was when their power began to crumble. They tried the usual tricks: guilt, charm, rage, feigned vulnerability. But you didn't react. Not because you stopped caring about people in general, but because you finally started caring about yourself. Your peace became more important than their approval. You no longer lived on edge, waiting for the next manipulation. You saw through the cycles, the love bombing, the gaslighting, the devaluation. It no longer had any hold. You didn't flinch when they raised their voice. You didn't scramble to explain yourself when they twisted the truth. You were no longer governed by their chaos, and that terrified them. You understood something crucial. They were never confused. They always knew how to be kind when they wanted something, and cruel when they sensed resistance. It wasn't a lack of understanding. It was a lack of respect, and when you stopped needing their validation, their ability to harm you disappeared. That scared them more than your anger ever could, because anger still meant engagement, but detachment, that was a closed door. The moment you no longer needed closure from them was the moment you took back your story. You no longer required their apology or acknowledgement to move on. You created your own ending, and that made you unreachable. You also let go of the fantasy that you could save them. For a long time you saw their wounds and believed your love could heal them. You tried to be patient, understanding, forgiving beyond reason. But healing is a personal responsibility, and you finally accepted that their pain was not your burden to carry. They manipulated your compassion, used your empathy as a leash. But you realized it's not kindness to allow yourself to be destroyed in the name of love. You stopped bleeding for someone who wouldn't stop cutting. You stopped shrinking so they could feel tall. You chose to survive. In that choice came another awakening. You took responsibility not for what happened to you, but for how you responded to it. That's what real power is. You faced uncomfortable truths about your patterns, your fears, and your silence. And instead of using that awareness to blame yourself, you used it to build. You created boundaries, values, and standards that reflected your worth. You no longer chased love. You became love. And with each day you stayed gone, you became someone they could no longer reach, predict, or control. You stopped being the version of you they depended on, the one who doubted herself, who apologized for breathing, who believed being chosen meant being mistreated. So no, the moment the narcissist knew you'd never return wasn't marked by rage or confrontation. It was marked by calm, by peace, by absence. You stopped talking. You stopped defending. You stopped explaining, and in that silence you became a mirror, reflecting everything they refused to see in themselves. You didn't just walk away, you transformed, and what returned in your place wasn't a wounded version of the past. It was someone whole, someone they never truly knew, and someone who would never again be a source of their power, certainly. Below is a 7-paragraph version of the speech, integrating and expanding on the point you saw behind the mask, while preserving the tone and depth of the original. There are no bold or italicized words, no headings, and the content flows as a single, cohesive narrative. There is a moment, quiet yet earth-shaking, when something inside you changes without warning, and the narcissist feels it like a chill in the room. They sense it in the way you look at them differently, how your eyes no longer reflect admiration, confusion, or need. You don't make a scene, you don't slam doors, but something fundamental breaks the spell. The dynamic that fed their ego begins to starve, and they don't know why at first, but you do, because deep inside you have stopped waiting for them to become someone they never were. You saw behind the mask. You finally recognized that what you were dealing with wasn't love distorted, but control disguised as affection. All the contradictions, how they could be so loving one moment and so cold the next, suddenly made sense. You stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who had weaponized your empathy. The charm, the theatrics, the carefully chosen words that once made you feel special now rang hollow. You stopped reacting to the bait. You saw the manipulation for what it was, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep you off balance and invested in the potential of someone who only existed in fragments. Their performance no longer moved you because you were no longer in the audience. You stopped playing the role they wrote for you, the role of the loyal, forgiving partner who always came back. Your silence became louder than any argument you'd ever had. It wasn't cold, it was final. That terrified them, because for all their posturing, all their confidence, narcissists rely on others to maintain the facade. When you stopped mirroring their importance back to them, the mask began to slip. And beneath it was something hollow, unsteady, and afraid. You no longer needed to prove your perspective. You stopped trying to be understood by someone who had no intention of truly listening. You had exhausted every possible way to explain your hurt, only to have it turned back on you. The moment you stopped justifying your boundaries was the moment they lost access to your vulnerability. The moment you stopped defending your decisions, they realized they had lost their ability to shape your reality. You walked away not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself more than you feared losing them. There was a time when you thought your love could reach them, change them, even redeem them. But the truth became undeniable. Love doesn't transform someone who believes there's nothing wrong with the way they treat you. You weren't cold-hearted for leaving. You were brave enough to stop sacrificing your peace for someone who fed off your confusion. You stopped asking what was wrong with you and started asking why you tolerated so much for so long. And in that quiet shift, you discovered something they could never offer: self-respect. The narcissist knew you'd never return when you stopped performing in their narrative and began writing your own. You started choosing discomfort over delusion. You began responding to your own needs rather than their demands. They tried to trigger old patterns: guilt, fear, obligation. But the hooks no longer sank in. You had seen too much. You had changed too deeply. And change, once it becomes truth, cannot be reversed. You had become someone who no longer needed their approval to feel whole. That was the final fracture in their control. So the moment they knew you'd never return wasn't loud or violent. It was composed. It was steady. It was the moment you saw the entire structure, the flattery, the blame, shifting, the manufactured drama, and chose not to engage. You saw the mask, and more importantly, you saw through it. You didn't leave in bitterness. You left in clarity. You became someone they could no longer reach because you became someone real. Someone who no longer needed fantasy, or there is a moment in every toxic entanglement when something quiet but irreversible happens. It doesn't come with fanfare or shouting. It doesn't even come with a goodbye. It begins inside you, in the space where confusion used to live. After all the tears, the arguments that looped in circles, and the endless attempts to be heard by someone who only ever listened when it benefited them, something simply clicks. You stop hoping, not out of bitterness, but out of a calm, sobering clarity. It's not that you give up on love or growth. It's that you finally stop looking for those things in someone who never intended to offer them. What makes this moment so powerful is how ordinary it looks from the outside. You go quiet not to manipulate, but because you've run out of things to explain. You stop reacting, not because you're numb, but because you're finally awake. The narcissist, for all their apparent confidence, can feel that shift. They don't always know how to name it, but they sense the change in energy, the loss of control. The patterns they relied on, the triggers they used to pull at will, suddenly stop working. And that's when panic sets in, not because they love you, but because they're losing their grip on someone who once kept their ego inflated. You used to get pulled back in by carefully chosen words or familiar threats. A certain tone, a certain silence, a certain phrase could unravel all your progress. They knew your buttons because you showed them in moments of vulnerability, but not anymore. Now, when they try to provoke guilt, you feel clarity. When they try to bait you into a fight, you choose stillness. They raise their voice and you don't flinch. They play the victim and you no longer rush in to soothe. You are not indifferent because you are cold. You are detached because you have healed. Your nervous system has recalibrated, and their chaos no longer feels like home. This emotional neutrality isn't easy to reach. It comes after cycles of self-betrayal and the painful realization that peace is not found in trying harder with someone who thrives on instability. You understand now that your triggers were never your weakness. They were the pathways into your deepest unhealed wounds, but you did the work. You faced the discomfort. You sat with the loneliness. You asked yourself hard questions about why you tolerated so much. And slowly you became the kind of person who does not abandon themselves for the sake of temporary connection. The narcissist feels this shift in ways they can't always express to them. It feels like you're slipping through their fingers, even if you're standing right in front of them. They may try harder at first. Love bombing, guilt trips, urgent apologies. But it's all just another test to see if the old levers still work. When you don't respond, they don't see strength. They see betrayal. But you no longer shape your behavior to be seen as good in their eyes. You don't need their validation. You've stopped dancing for someone who was never going to offer a place to rest. And in that calm refusal to be moved, you became someone unfamiliar to them. Not because you've changed into someone else, but because you've finally returned to who you were before the fear, before the self-doubt, before the manipulation taught you to shrink. You no longer chase conversations to be understood. You no longer replay their words at night, wondering what you could have done differently. You no longer compromise your sanity in the name of working it out. You understand now that love without safety isn't love, it's survival. And you're not surviving anymore, you're living. So when they realized they couldn't trigger you anymore, that their presence didn't provoke anxiety or longing, but simply silence, that was the moment they knew. You weren't pretending, you weren't bluffing, you were done, not out of hate, but out of truth, not out of anger, but out of alignment. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped standing in the doorway. And in that stillness, in that grounded, unshakable silence, they finally saw the one thing they never thought they would: the end. There is a moment that doesn't come with thunder or applause, but it marks the turning point in your life. It happens silently, often in the middle of an ordinary day when you stop reacting the way you always have. You no longer explain your worth to someone who only ever made you feel like a question. You no longer wait for their mood to dictate your own. The old anxiety, the constant mental spinning trying to figure out what you did wrong, suddenly feels exhausting instead of necessary. And in that quiet exhaustion, you choose to stop. You put it all down, not because you've given up, but because you're ready to begin again, this time on your own terms. For so long, your life revolved around their emotional weather. When they were pleased, you felt safe. When they were distant or cold, you became frantic. You didn't know it at the time, but you were living inside their chaos. It became your normal. Their inconsistency, their sharp turns from affection to cruelty, their rewriting of events, these things created a world in which you could never feel solid. You lost your sense of what was real, what was fair, and most dangerously, what you deserved. You confused adrenaline for connection, fear for intensity, and pain for purpose. And in that confusion, you disappeared from yourself. Eventually, something in you started to rebel. You got tired of walking on eggshells. You began to crave peace more than approval. You started noticing how often you were anxious for no reason, how often you apologized for things that weren't your fault. You caught yourself rationalizing behavior you would never accept from anyone else. These weren't just passing thoughts. They were cracks in the story you'd been telling yourself. You didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of order. Not the kind of control the narcissist imposed to dominate, but the kind of structure that comes from inner clarity. The kind that allows you to breathe. Real order isn't rigid or loud. It doesn't demand submission or perfection. It offers balance. It comes when you decide to stop chasing someone else's approval and start listening to your own needs. You began to make choices based on what aligned with your values, not what would temporarily soothe someone else's ego. You cleaned up your space, you slept better, you ate with intention. These small acts were revolutionary, not because they were dramatic, but because they were yours. For the first time in a long time, you were living from the inside out, not reacting from the outside in. The narcissist noticed. They always do. They felt the shift, even if they didn't have words for it. You were less available, less predictable. Your reactions no longer came on cue. Their chaos no longer affected you the way it used to. You didn't lose your temper or dissolve into tears. You stayed calm, and that calm wasn't empty. It was full of strength, and that made them uncomfortable, because your life was no longer orbiting around their needs, their moods, or their narratives. You had found your center, and they could no longer reach you from the outside. What unnerved them most wasn't your anger or your silence. It was your stability. You were no longer the person who could be shaken with a glare or drawn back in with a crumb of affection. You were no longer desperate for them to see you, understand you, or choose you. You had chosen yourself. You had built something they couldn't access, a world of your own, one with boundaries, purpose, and direction, one where you could finally think clearly and trust your own voice. And in that space, their influence faded like background noise you no longer had to tolerate. So the moment they knew you'd never return wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was clean. It was when you brought order to what used to be chaos. When you stopped mistaking emotional turbulence for connection, when you stopped trying to fix someone who benefited from your confusion, you walked away not to punish them, but to restore yourself. And in that order, in that clarity, in that peace, they saw the one thing they never expected, your life steady without them. You don't wait for them to understand. You don't hold your breath hoping for accountability that never comes. Instead, something in you decides that your healing can't be postponed any longer. That's when you begin to take back your power, not through confrontation, but through choice, not through vengeance, but through responsibility. And it's in that moment, subtle and uncelebrated, that the narcissist realizes they've lost their grip on you completely. Taking responsibility doesn't mean accepting blame for what was never yours to carry. It doesn't mean justifying their cruelty or rewriting history to make sense of the senseless. It means recognizing where you gave away your voice, where you silenced your instincts, and where you tolerated what should have been unacceptable. You start to see the quiet ways you abandoned yourself, how often you stayed when you should have left, how often you tried to prove your worth instead of remembering it. And instead of drowning in shame, you let the truth wash over you like cold, clear water. It wakes you up. In that awakening, you stop asking questions that keep you stuck. Why did they treat me this way? How could they not care? Why wasn't I enough? Those questions once felt necessary. Now they feel hollow. You realize that trying to understand someone who thrives on confusion is a losing game, so instead you turn the focus inward, not to judge, but to rebuild. You begin to ask better questions. What did I learn about myself through this? What boundaries did I never enforce? Where did I stay silent when I should have spoken? This shift isn't easy, but it's the only way forward. Responsibility brings with it a strange sort of grief. You grieve the version of you who didn't know better. The one who confused loyalty with love, who thought that sacrificing herself was noble. You sit with the ache of wasted time, missed warnings, and all the red flags you tried to paint white. But through that grief, you gain something solid. You begin to understand that self-abandonment can look like devotion when you're in survival mode. And you forgive yourself, not with excuses, but with compassion. Because you know now that you were doing the best you could with the awareness you had. And then you change, not all at once and not always gracefully, but you start making different choices. You say no where you once said yes. You pause before reacting. You stop rescuing, fixing, and explaining. You stop expecting others to be what you need and start giving that to yourself. And the narcissist, watching from a distance, sometimes literally, sometimes emotionally, feels the difference. They realize the dynamic has shifted. Their words don't pull you back. Their silence doesn't punish you. You are no longer bound by the invisible contract that once kept you in their orbit. What they don't understand is that your growth wasn't about them. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was a quiet decision to stop bleeding for someone who kept handing you the knife. You took your power back by no longer outsourcing your peace. You stopped waiting for someone else to fix the damage they caused and decided instead to stop reopening the wound. This is what real responsibility looks like. Not martyrdom, not perfection, but ownership. Ownership of your healing, your choices, and your future. So the moment they knew you'd never return wasn't born out of anger or rebellion. It came when you stepped fully into your own life, when you stopped needing them to make things right. When you stopped needing them at all, you didn't become heartless. You became whole, and in the quiet strength of that wholeness, they saw something they could no longer reach. Not because you built a wall, but because you built a home inside yourself and locked the door from the inside. Certainly, here's the speech expanded into 7 unified paragraphs, focusing on the theme of you no longer needed closure, written in a natural, flowing style without bold text, italics, or headings. There is a moment that arrives so quietly you almost miss it. It's not wrapped in dramatic exits or angry final words. It's more like an exhale after holding your breath for far too long. It happens when you stop trying to make sense of what never made sense, and you finally release the need for closure from someone who was never capable of giving it. You realize that no amount of explanations will rewrite the truth or make your pain feel justified in their eyes. And in that stillness, something inside you starts to settle. You're no longer waiting. Not for apologies, not for understanding, not for anything. You had spent so much time trying to get them to see how much you loved them, to see how much they hurt you, to see the damage they caused while convincing you it was your fault. You rehearsed conversations in your mind, thinking that the right words would finally unlock the empathy they always withheld. But it never happened. Every attempt to gain closure became another doorway to more confusion. The more you reached for peace, the further it drifted. The more you asked for honesty, the more distortion you received. And slowly, painfully, you began to see the truth. They were never going to give you what you needed. Closure, you thought, would come with a conversation. One last meaningful talk where the past would be acknowledged and your experience validated. But that conversation either never came, or when it did, it left you feeling even emptier. That's when you started to understand that closure isn't something you get from them. It's something you give to yourself. It's the moment you decide that your healing does not depend on their accountability. It's not about forgiveness on their terms. It's not about hearing them admit they were wrong. It's about no longer needing their version of the story to live your life. There's power in that decision, and also deep sadness, because the loss becomes final in a new way, not because you can't go back, but because you no longer want to. You stop romanticizing the good moments, stop editing out the pain, and see the relationship for what it really was. There's grief in letting go of the fantasy, in accepting that the person you needed them to be doesn't exist. But that grief is clean. It doesn't twist itself into hope. It just asks to be felt, and once it is, it begins to loosen its grip. You don't numb it, you don't deny it, you simply let it pass through. When you stop needing closure, you also stop needing them to understand. You no longer search for evidence to justify your experience. You stop trying to explain your decision to walk away. You recognize that peace isn't found in being agreed with, it's found in standing firm even when misunderstood. You used to think you needed their permission to leave, but now you know your clarity is enough. Their silence, once unbearable, becomes irrelevant. Their words, once intoxicating, lose their power. You don't need them to say goodbye. You've already closed the door. In that quiet self-respect, something new begins to grow. You create closure by choosing to live not in reaction to them, but in alignment with yourself. You start caring less about what they think and more about how you feel. You invest in spaces where you're seen clearly, not questioned constantly. You rediscover the parts of you that were buried under guilt and over-explanation, and you build a future that no longer includes them, not as punishment, but as liberation. You leave not because you hate them, but because you love yourself enough to stop waiting. So the moment they knew you'd never return wasn't filled with dramatic declarations. It was subtle. It was the way your voice no longer trembled, the way you didn't reach back when they tried to pull you in, the way you smiled without needing their approval. You didn't slam the door. They just watched it close, and for the first time you didn't turn around. That was the moment, not when they lost you, but when you finally chose yourself. There is a moment in every person's life when the truth becomes too heavy to keep inside. It builds slowly over weeks, months, or even years. The things you dismissed, the pain you minimized, the stories you rewrote in your mind to make them easier to live with eventually, they begin to press against your chest, demanding release. And when that moment comes, you speak. Not because you're certain of the outcome, but because the cost of silence has grown too great. You speak even though your voice trembles, even though your heart races, even though you fear everything might fall apart. You speak because if you don't, something inside you will. For so long you told yourself it wasn't that bad. You made excuses for what you knew deep down was wrong. You played the peacemaker, the understanding one, the person who could always rise above. You softened the blow of their words and swallowed your own to keep the peace, but peace built on denial is not peace, it's submission. And there comes a point when the only way to reclaim your life is to tell the truth about what it has become. Not just to others, but to yourself. You have to name the harm, you have to stop dressing it up, and in doing so, you begin to remember who you are beneath the silence. When you finally began to speak, it wasn't to destroy anyone. It was to find your footing. You weren't looking for revenge. You were looking for reality, for the ground under your feet to stop shifting, for someone to finally say, yes, that happened. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it mattered. But when you spoke your truth to the narcissist, you quickly learned that the truth threatens them. They twist it. They minimize it. They accuse you of overreacting, of being dramatic, of rewriting history. They demand your silence because your truth disrupts the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. And still, you kept speaking. Maybe not to them anymore, but to yourself, to others who could actually hear you, and to the parts of your soul that needed to know you wouldn't abandon them again. You spoke in journals, in therapy, in quiet moments of reflection. You told your story piece by piece, not because it made everything easier, but because it made everything real. You stopped gaslighting yourself. You stopped doubting your memory. You stopped apologizing for your pain. And every time you honored your own experience, even when your voice was shaky, your strength grew a little louder. The truth became your foundation, not your enemy. You stopped being afraid of how others would receive it, and started caring more about how long you had kept it buried. You realized that honesty wasn't a weapon. It was a doorway, a way back to yourself. And with every truth you spoke, the guilt and confusion that once paralyzed you began to dissolve. You no longer needed their approval to believe your own reality. You no longer needed them to confirm what you lived through. You had your own voice now, and that voice was becoming steady, even if it had once been uncertain, and they noticed. They noticed you no longer hesitated. You didn't ask for permission to feel. You didn't explain your boundaries or justify your needs. You stated them. You drew lines not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You stopped accepting half-hearted apologies and excuses wrapped in charm. You started valuing truth over harmony and dignity over temporary comfort. And that made you someone they couldn't manipulate anymore. Someone who wouldn't be drawn back into a lie just to keep the peace. So the moment they knew you'd never return wasn't when you yelled or slammed the door. It was when you told the truth without flinching, when you said what needed to be said and didn't take it back. When you no longer watered yourself down to protect their ego, they saw it in your eyes, the steadiness, the resolve, the absence of doubt. You had faced the fear that kept you quiet and walked through it anyway. And in doing so, you became untouchable to the person who once fed off your silence.